It's great to take part in another CEP event, this time as a part-time member of the team. I'm going to base my remarks fairly closely on the monitoring team's most recently published 1267 report, their 30th report on the status of and the threat from ISIL and al-Qaeda. I'll try to be brief and, as you said, leave plenty of time for comments, questions and answers afterwards. So starting as we go into the slides with the overview and evolution of the threat. So I think that's slide number 3, if I'm, next slide, I think. Yeah, so in conflict zones and by extension in neighboring member states to conflict zones, the threat remains high. In non-conflict zones, although there's sort of the suppression of the threat by COVID-related restrictions is now fading away, the threat is still, moderate, relatively low. There's a big contrast between the threat in conflict zones and non-conflict zones. Now, ISIL and al-Qaeda rely on conflict zones for their successes these days, but of course they also aspire to project a threat into non-conflict zones, and that goes directly to what Hans was just saying in his introduction about the fact that there will be this cycle and delay of growing capability in conflict zones to the renewal of a threat outside. Now, one highlight of our report was the most detailed account yet published of the ISIL General Directorate of Provinces, or GDP, and of the networks that it manages. And this includes, besides the Iraqi and Syrian networks, 7 additional hub and spoke organizational structures in various stages of evolution. The 3 most dynamic of these are based in Afghanistan, Somalia, and the Lake Chad Basin. It's notable that 2 of the 3 most dynamic ISIL networks are in Africa, which is also the location of some of al-Qaeda's most dangerous affiliates. Member states remain acutely concerned about the spread of terrorist violence in Africa. However, the most striking development of early 2022 took place in Syria with the Hasaka jailbreak in late January, followed by the 3rd of February US-led counter-terrorism operation in which the ISIL leader Amir al-Salbi was killed. Sorry, we should move to the next slide at this point. It took ISIL until the 10th of March to announce his death and to name his successor as Abu al-Hassan al-Hashmi al-Qurayshi, with video footage, of course, as the previous time, of ISIL affiliates pledging allegiance around the world. Next slide, please. Even more striking was the killing of al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri in a US drone strike in Kabul on the 31st of July. He is expected to be replaced by Saif al-Adil, but Saif and the new al-Qaeda number 2, Abdurrahman al-Maghribi, are both believed to be in Iran. At present, al-Qaeda show no sign of addressing the leadership issue in public, partly, I think, to avoid contradicting the Taliban's tentative narrative on what actually happened on the 31st of July. Now, ISIL and al-Qaeda may be weakened by a rapid succession of leadership losses in recent years, but member states still worry that they will exploit continuing instability in Syria and Afghanistan. International efforts to address the internally displaced camps and the detention facilities in northeast Syria are still insufficient to address the seriousness of the issue. Besides the humanitarian imperative, this is a ticking time bomb in security terms. There is a risk of losing thousands to any chance of rehabilitation and creating a threat multiplier that will still be with us in 20 years' time. Next slide, please. Moving now to regional developments and starting in Africa. ISIL is represented in Mozambique by Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama, ASWJ, which comes under the Al-Qarar office, or the AKO of ISIL, based in Puntland, Somalia. Regional member states continue to report no evidence of command and control by ISIL over ASWJ, but that may be something that is a work in progress. And of course, it's very hard to obtain evidence of this. It's going to be a partial picture that each person is seeing. Cabo Delgado province has seen a rash of small-scale violent attacks in remote villages resulting from the disruption of ASWJ's leadership by regional forces who came to Mozambique's assistance. Killings, abductions, looting and destruction of property have displaced the local population, and over 800,000 IDPs have sought refuge in neighboring districts. Tanzanian national Abu Yasser Hassan heads ASWJ, which has lost 100 fighters already this year, which has sort of reduced its fighting strength to somewhere between 200 and 400 perhaps. ASWJ foreign terrorist fighters are mostly from Tanzania and Kenya. There are some from Somalia, DRC, and Uganda. And the use of the Swahili language facilitates communication and assimilation amongst all of the elements involved. Cross-border raids into Tanzania have increased, with 4 recent clashes in Tanzanian border villages. In May, Tanzania arrested 30 terrorists attempting to cross the border. ASWJ lost momentum in April and May also as climatic conditions and impending famine impacted their fighters. And over 200 women and children were released because ASWJ couldn't feed them. Now, next slide moves us to the DRC, where the local group associated with ISIL and the al-Qaeda office is the Allied Democratic Forces, ADF. Now, despite joint Congolese and Ugandan military operations against them, the ADF killed an increasing number of civilians in early 2022. The ADF, led by Seka, aka Musa Baluku, renewed the group's pledge of allegiance to new ISIL leader Abu al-Hassan in a video released on the 1st of April. The ADF splinter group loyal to Jamil Mukulu, which rejects Baluku's allegiance to ISIL, was weakened by the 11 January arrest of one of its leaders. ADF membership is Ugandan and Congolese, whilst its rising numbers of foreign terrorist fighters come from Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, and Somalia. The Congolese have arrested some seasoned FTFs who have fought in multiple theatres of conflict. Over 100 ADF suspects were arrested following the bombings in Uganda in October and November 2021. The key challenge is to disrupt ADF support networks, impeding the movement of FTFs through the region and cutting off their source of funding. Next slide moves us to Somalia, where al-Shabaab has achieved some of its largest scale attacks of recent years this year. Member states estimate that it has 7,000 to 12,000 fighters, and it generates millions of dollars of revenue from its taxation of all aspects of Somalia's economy. It is secure enough in its funding actually to subsidize the al-Qaeda parent directly. Ahmed Daria, the al-Shabaab leader, now ranks number 4 in al-Qaeda's global leadership. By contrast, the ISIL presence in Puntland is small, just 200 to 280 fighters, and it is operationally constrained by pressure from al-Shabaab. However, it holds great significance as the venue of the al-Qaeda office, which is led by the Emir of ISIL Somalia, Abdul Qadir Mumin, who himself is a native of Puntland, but he's also a UK Somali dual national, who, having been a senior al-Shabaab ideologue, pledged allegiance to ISIL in 2015. Now, member states assess that the AKO acts as a financial hub for ISIL, not just within its own network, which, as I've said, includes Mozambique and the DRC, but more widely in Africa and even outside Africa. One member state reports that the AKO sends funds to Afghanistan via Yemen, while another says that an AKO cell in the United Kingdom plays a role in moving money from the AKO to Afghanistan. Now, it's not clear how much of the money that the AKO moves for ISIL is generated locally in and around Somalia in their own network, their own region. But it's a matter that needs to be studied much further, because this is evolving information, and I think very significant. Moving on to the next slide, we are now in West Africa and the Western Sahel region, where Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, JNIM, is increasing its control and expanding towards the Atlantic coasts. It exploits local grievances, human rights abuses, and poor governance to gain support for its ideology. Abu Ubaidah Yusuf al-Anabi, also known as Yazid Mebrak, now ranks number 3 in al-Qaeda's global leadership. Based in Algeria, he links Jainim to al-Qaeda, and he promotes Jainim within the al-Qaeda leadership Hittin committee. The Jainim leader, Iyad Aghali, reports to him. Ghali is primarily assisted by Amadou Koufa, Sudan Aghita, and Talha al-Libi. Jainim has further opened up a corridor to the south through Burkina Faso with the support of Ansar al-Islam, which is now effectively part of the Jainim coalition. Jafar Diko remains the leader of Ansar al-Islam and is reported by one member state to be directly under the command of AQIM leader Mebrak. Jainim recruits from Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Togo are trained in Burkina Faso and then redeployed to their countries of origin. In Togo, of course, 8 soldiers were killed and 13 wounded in a big attack on the 11th of May on their military base in the Kafenjel prefecture. Jainim also suffered setbacks during this period, with several prominent figures killed and groups of fighters neutralized. But it's still of concern that while international counterterrorism arrangements are in a period of transition in that part of the world, Jainim and ISGS did manage to agree a ceasefire in the last week of May to focus efforts against Malian forces. Now, I think we're moving to the next slide at this point. ISGS, yes, indeed, the Greater Sahara was announced as a province separate from IS West Africa province on the 23rd of March. But this seems to me to be cosmetic, as in the similar case of where they talk about IS Mozambique, because I don't think there's been any change or arrangements within the regional network, in this instance supervised by the Al-Furqan office, or AFO, from the Lake Chad Basin. ISGS is under pressure from Jainim and other local armed groups, and also from the Dawsahak Tuaregs, who reject ISIL atrocities and extortion and general sort of brutal methods. It's struggling to sustain its presence in the tri-border area between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Next slide, please. Now, in northeastern Nigeria, which is where the IS West Africa province has its headquarters in the Lake Chad Basin, IS West Africa province, or ISWAP, has confirmed its dominance over the remnants of Boko Haram, some of whom do remain in the Lake Chad border area with Niger under Bakura. But Boko Haram personnel have mainly joined ISWAP, and of course, large numbers of their dependents and associated community have surrendered to the Nigerian government. The ISWAP leader, Abu Musab al-Barnawi, is reported by some member states to have resumed his former position as head of the Al-Furqan office, the AFO, while others report him to be dead. Now, we've seen inaccurate reports of deaths of leaders in this part of the world before, so we're holding our judgment on this. We don't want to give a verdict one way or the other just yet. Violence remains endemic in this area, with frequent kidnappings for ransom and attacks on civilian and military targets, both in Nigeria and in Niger. In northwestern Nigeria, Ansaru pledged allegiance to Jainim on the 31st of December 2021. Member states fear that an al-Qaeda affiliate in the region could merge with local organized criminals and former Boko Haram operatives in the states of Kaduna, Katsina, Niger, and Zamfara. In Zamfara, unidentified groups killed about 200 people in January, 20 in March, 50 in May. It's difficult to be absolutely sure of what the nature of these killings was because of the sort of confusion and the lack of clarity as to the exact affiliation of some of the actors. Moving to North Africa now, next slide. Member states are concerned at the threat from terrorist prisoners whose sentences are almost served. Many of them are assessed to pose an ongoing threat. And there are also concerns about North African FTFs recently released in other countries. In some ways, the situation in parts of North Africa resembles the situation that we'll come to in Europe. Moving to Sinai, Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, or ABM, which is the Sinai affiliate of ISIL, carried out attacks in Rafah city and in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula, including against Egyptian armed forces. They also attacked a gas pipeline. But the group is still assessed to be in decline. It's confined to a relatively small area of northern Sinai and probably doesn't have more than 500 fighters. In Libya, ISIL is mainly confined in the south, but seeks to revive its logistical nodes in the north, especially in Bani Walid and near the Tunisian border in Sabratha, excuse me, to facilitate the arrival of additional fighters. It's assessed to have less than 100 fighters in Libya, but these numbers are not firm. And I think there are some people who think that the situation in Libya is rather shapeless, and maybe we are understating how serious it is because we don't see clear numbers. Some FTFs with ISIL Libya from sub-Saharan Africa may have established a link between the group and other terrorist groups in the Sahel, Somalia, and Sudan. One member state noted that ISIL Libya seeks to recruit migrants across the southern borders. Another reported that the group maintains links into Nigeria, with some Libyan FTFs hosted by ISWAP in the Lake Chad Basin. Al-Qaeda sees central and southwestern Libya as a base to send reinforcements to northern Mali. The cities of Obari and Sabha are home to the main terrorist structures of Al-Qaeda in Libya. Moving to the next slide, Iraq and the Levant. The ISIL leader al-Salbi was killed, as I said, on the 3rd of February in a US operation in Atma in the northwestern part of Syria, close to the Turkish border. On the 10th of March, ISIL announced their new leader as Abu al-Hassan. Other leadership losses include the former spokesperson Abu Hamza al-Qureshi, who was killed, according to one member state, in November 2021 in an airstrike in Aleppo province. There is no member state consensus regarding the identity of the new leader of ISIL. The Iraqi candidates for that person include Juma Awad Ibrahim al-Badri, the brother of the former ISIL leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And then another candidate is the former head of the General Directorate of Provinces, Abdur Rauf al-Muhajir. And then a third Iraqi candidate is Bashar Khatab Ghazal al-Sumaidai, also known as Dr. Zaid. And it is Sumaidai who is most often cited in the debate around this point. Despite possibly circular reporting, though, that he is Abu al-Hassan, a number of member states argue that although he has been an influential ideologue, he has not recently held senior posts within ISIL that could have positioned him as a credible candidate to take over the leadership this year. So my broad sense of this is that he is probably not the leader. Of course, we've had this very interesting develop with the arrest by Turkish authorities of what was initially billed as an ISIL leader, or possibly the ISIL leader, near Istanbul in May. Now, some member states assessed that the man arrested was Sumaidai, but those member states also said probably the leader would not have been in Turkey, and probably it is indeed Sumaidai who's in custody. And of course, the Turks have recently talked about this again more recently. But the consensus is that the actual leader, whose alias is Abu al-Hassan, remains at large. And of course, ISIL themselves have not commented on this, but it's difficult for them. They may feel obliged to comment in due course, just because of the concern that they went to the trouble of all of that choreography of the leadership change. And at the moment, there's an unchallenged narrative out there that suggests that possibly the new leader is in custody. Now, despite leadership attrition, member states observe no significant change of direction for ISIL or for its operations. It's still able to organize complex attacks in the areas where it has major affiliates in conflict zones. The Iraqi-Syrian border remains a major vulnerability where multiple smuggling networks operate. The combined number of ISIL fighters in Iraq and Syria is probably between 6,000 and 10,000, mainly in rural areas. I mentioned the jailbreak freeing fighters from the Sinai prison in Hasaka in northeastern Syria. about maybe 100 to 300 prisoners got out, fled to the Badia Desert. Maybe some of them crossed the border to Iraq. But of course, the number of fugitives is offset by the number of casualties that the group took in mounting the attack. And that limits the net operational impact of the operation. It's also true that no senior ISIL leader was reported to have managed to escape. So it's not clear that ISIL is stronger because of the attack, but it did give a significant propaganda boost to the group. And I think more jailbreak attempts should be expected, particularly in northeastern Syria. And of course, it was a jarring reminder of the precariousness of the holding arrangements in northeastern Syria. ISIL mounted other insurgent attacks around Syria, sometimes even in Damascus. And it's reported to have resumed its previously curtailed training activities in the Badia Desert. Moving across to northwestern Syria, and I think this takes us onto the next slide. In fact, yes, sorry, we're already on the next slide. We need one more slide on, please. Thank you very much. The Idlib de-escalation area continues to serve as a strategic location for ISIL, even though it is actually, that area is under near total control by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which remains the predominant terrorist group in northwestern Syria, with about 10,000 fighters. HTS continues to seek to portray itself as opposed to international terrorism and regularly conducts hostile operations against Huras ad-Din, the other al-Qaeda affiliated group in the area. Huras ad-Din is reported to include many foreign terrorist fighters, and it's reported that some of them were ordered to travel to Afghanistan, but were either unable or unwilling to do so. One member state indicated that the Huras ad-Din leader, Samir Hijazi, also known as Farouk Asuri, was appointed to the al-Qaeda leadership's Hittin committee in 2020 or 2021. A number of member states reported that the East Turkestan Islamic movement has between 1,000 and 2,000 fighters in this region under the command of Kewsair. And they tend to be fairly closely allied with HTS and sort of carrying out contracted tasks, manning roadblocks and things of that kind, maintaining local order, raising funds, and maintaining a combat readiness. Next slide, please, as we move to Iraq, where counter-terrorism pressure has limited ISIL activity, but cells persist in the desert, remote areas of the country. The group mainly attacks infrastructure and agriculture, and its main activities are in Salahuddin, Diyala, and Kirkuk governorates. Some of the attackers may even be fugitives from the detention facilities across the Syrian border. There have been attacks also in Anbar and Ninawa governorates, where ISIL operates mainly in small mobile cells. During Ramadan, there was a global campaign of enhanced operation activity to avenge ISIL's fallen leaders. And in Iraq, that manifested in quite a lot of attacks on security forces and also on other Iraqi communities to try to drive wedges between the Iraqi Sunni population and others. Information from Sami Jassim al-Jabouri, whose arrest Iraq announced in October 2021, has more recently shown us that he was, right up until his capture, in charge of ISIL finances. He had served simultaneously in two additional positions. He was the deputy to Amir al-Salbi, and he was a member of the delegated committee of ISIL. So member states are looking at this. They think his capture has severely disrupted the group and its finances. And of course, that would have been exacerbated by other leadership losses and particularly the killing of al-Salbi. But of course, there's the point about its finances being disrupted by Jabouri's capture. And the fact that because he was captured, he's then a source of intelligence on the group as well. It's possible also that because he occupied a number of roles, that they may have had to give those different roles to different individuals. Of course, ISIL activities in Iraq and Syria inspire attacks in the wider Middle East or Levant region. And one such attack occurred on 27th of March in Israel, which caused more than a dozen casualties. While ISIL continues to aspire to revive a global operations capability, its reach remains limited so far, and Iraq and the Levant continue to be the center of gravity of the group and to define its identity. And I think over time, there is an interesting question over how successfully they're able to maintain their cohesiveness, given the the need to delegate more authority to the remote provinces and the heavy reliance on the remote provinces for providing propaganda material. Moving to the Arabian Peninsula, next slide. I won't go much into this because it's not much in the way of news. It's steady state, but AQAP remains a significant threat in Yemen and also maintains the ambition to mount attacks beyond, and it has of course inspired and facilitated attacks outside. So it must be taken seriously. Still several thousand fighters, still has a good grounding in the tribal structures in Marib, Abyan and Shabwa. And it has a small number of foreign terrorist fighters as well. Even so, they keep losing people as well. They lost a significant military commander in January, Saleh Abulan. So I think we maintain a watching brief on AQAP, but it isn't the force that it used to be when it was the primary source of threat to civil aviation, as you will all recall. It still remains the crucial al-Qaeda affiliate for dissemination of propaganda, including illustrated claims of attacks, and it publishes commemoration of deceased fighters, biographies, and it is a source of encouragement for lone actor attacks as well. By comparison, next slide, ISIL Yemen, really, there's not much to say about it. A downward trajectory still, no recent attacks. Its main value really probably resides in the presence of the al-Qura office of the General Directorate of Provinces, and the facilitation and financial links that it maintains across the Red Sea to the al-Qura office in Somalia. I'm not going to say, next slide is Europe, but I'm not going to say anything on Europe because others will be wanting to talk about that. So I'm going to skip right through that and move on to finish off with just a few words on Central and South Asia. And just to say on this, that still the Taliban's victory was a major encouragement to international terrorist organizations in Afghanistan. You look at this, al-Shabaab feel this in Somalia. It is a significant factor in the international narrative that the West was defeated in Afghanistan, and the Taliban much admired as a result. And of course, that's more with al-Qaeda groups. ISIL tend to be very dismissive of the Taliban, but I think the general inspiration that the Taliban have provided to people who are in that sort of Salafi jihadi tradition and anti-Western is a significant factor. Little bit on Zawahiri, won't say much, but perhaps there'll be questions on this. I think you all followed so closely what happened with Zawahiri's death. It was interesting. When we retrospectively looked at Zawahiri's video output, it was obvious that he was able to communicate more comfortably and more currently over the previous year or so, and clearly, he was benefiting from the fact that the Taliban had won in Afghanistan. And we said in our report that he was in Afghanistan, but we didn't realize that he had actually been moved to Kabul. So that was very interesting. There is a succession challenge to the network, of course, with his killing. And therefore, the impact on al-Qaeda is not clear. It may be very disruptive of them, but of course, it's also possible that you could have a new and more dynamic leader. The leader should be Saif al-Adil, but this question occurs now of what happens when the most senior member of al-Qaeda is in Iran. Does he relocate from Iran? Do the Iranians let him leave? Because there's an element of leverage there for Iran. And if he leaves, can the Taliban afford to welcome him to Afghanistan after the embarrassment that they had with the killing of Zawahiri in Kabul? So I think this is important to monitor, and I know my former colleagues will be keen to to provide some kind of answers on what has happened with the al-Qaeda succession when they write the next report in December. It's not just, of course, it was not just Zawahiri in Afghanistan. You also had al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. Several hundred quite effective fighters from the region fighting alongside the Taliban. They were involved in the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, and they. It's not quite clear what their future is. Sometimes the Taliban talk about increasing their fighting strength, both at their Ministry of Defense and their Ministry of Interior, which is under Sirajuddin Haqqani, as you know. And one possibility would be for some of the foreign extremists in Afghanistan to be naturalized as Afghans. And of course, the Haqqani network has the ability to do that because they control all the relevant portfolios in the de facto Afghan authorities. But they may lack the resources to massively expand their armed forces and their paramilitary forces. So it's not entirely clear exactly what's going to happen with that. And then I think probably the last slide that I'll look at, if you move on, it should be ISIL-K. So what do we say about the threat from ISIL-K? It is likely to pose a great threat in the short to medium term in Afghanistan. The leader, Sanaullah Ghaffari, also known as Shahab al-Muhajir, is in firm control and also appears to have a good and cordial relationship with the leader of the GDP's al-Siddiq office, the ASO, Sheikh Tamim al-Kurdi, who has been in Afghanistan since 2020. He was sent in by the GDP. ISIL-K is trying to strengthen its capabilities by recruiting members from other terrorist groups. And of course, it's trying to attract disaffected Taliban fighters and dissatisfied local ethnic minorities. And several member states have reported that it's able to recruit based on its payment of higher monthly salaries, which was always an issue of competition between the Taliban and ISIL-K in Afghanistan. It claimed firing rockets into Tajikistan and Uzbekistan earlier this year. Both countries denied being hit, but still, there's definitely a cross-border threat that ISIL-K is capable of posing. And with the ASO al-Siddiq office charged with ISIL business in South and Central Asia, ISIL-K is likely to show regional ambitions, but it doesn't, I think, pose at the moment a threat more distantly. It doesn't have the capacity to project a threat beyond Afghanistan and its immediate region. But we should watch out for that because it's one of the places where an external operational capability could be regenerated. And just a couple of other organizations to remember their presence in Afghanistan. You've got Tajik extremists, Uzbek extremists, Pakistani extremists, Uyghur extremists. Jamaat Ansarullah, the Tajik group, closely associated with al-Qaeda. And there's this is a source of conflict between the Taliban, or source of dispute between the Taliban and Tajikistan because of the possible exploitation of the Taliban of Tajik extremists as a threat to Tajikistan. And then I just finish off with a quick mention of TTP, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban, because that is, of course, the biggest numerically group of foreign extremists in Afghanistan, 3,000 to 4,000 of them. And of course, it is the source of potential dispute between the Afghan Taliban and Islamabad because of the unstable triangular relationship between the Afghan Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, and the Pakistani government. And there has been a persistent attempt by the Afghan Taliban to broker. They have a temporary ceasefire where they were able to broker with Pakistan, but the TTP demands of Pakistan look absurd and completely unrealistic. The Pakistanis can't possibly agree to what the TTP wants, and therefore it becomes a really interesting question as to how far this starts to damage the understanding between the Afghan Taliban and Islamabad. And I'll leave it at that point. Sorry, I probably